Oh, yeah, it's on. Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It promises to be a really interesting discussion. So the format of the panel will be that myself and Jay will ask some questions, and each panelist will give their thoughts in turn. And at the end, hopefully, we should have time for some audience discussion, input, questions. So if you have any thoughts during the panel, please do remember them, hold on to them, and there'll be time to discuss them at the end.
Okay, so just to briefly introduce our panelists, Dr. Bethan Marshall over here is a senior lecturer in English and Education at King's College London. She's a past chair of the National Association for the Teaching of English, and her latest book, which is coming out at the end of this year, is Policy, Belief and Practice in the Secondary English Classroom, a case study approach from Canada, England and Scotland. Dr. Priya Gopal, over here, is a teaching fellow in English at Churchill and a highly outspoken advocate of decolonising the curriculum. Some of you may have seen her open letter to Mary Beard following a recent Twitter dispute. I'm sure she needs no further introduction.
So we've also got two students with us today. Got Lena, who is an HSBS student at Newnham, and Jason, who is I actually don't know what college you're at. Pembroke, but he's a writer, activist and campaigner on black and queer issues, leading the Kuku BME campaign.
Okay, so on to our first question. We'll give all our panelists the chance to answer every question that we ask, and we'll try and leave 15 minutes at the end for all of your questions, so do be thinking about that. Our first question is, what does it mean to say the curriculum is impacted by the legacy of colonialism? Jason, would you like to start?
I think when we speak about that, people often think it's very metaphorical, but actually it refers to very real instances of colonial violence. So there's a philosopher historian called Boaventura who speaks about epistemicide, and this is literally the discussion of the way in which colonizing missions weren't just about enslaving people or exploiting countries. They also led to the mass burning of libraries, so the mass burning of artworks as well. So African and Asian and Arab nations, which were hubs of intellectual thought, lots of their work ended up being destroyed or placed into the hands of Western people who then claimed it as their own. So there's a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, called Ramon Grosfoguel, and he takes Boaventura's idea of epistemicide and applies it today. And what his discussion asks is, why is it that white men of 5 countries, so of the UK, the States, France, Germany, and Italy, are seen as the fountains of all knowledge? Or why did they take on this kind of Cartesian philosophy of pure rational thinking? And this kind of colonial violence therefore informs the canon today, because if we think about the ways in which institutions like Cambridge are complicit in this colonial violence, this is reproduced when we have reading lists which are entirely white men of 5 countries. It's reproduced when you don't consider authors of the global south, and when you take part in this continued epistemicide and this death of intellectual thought of authors who are not white and who are not Western. And in which case, yeah, I think that when we refer to the curriculum as informed by legacy of colonialism, we are literally talking about real events. We are talking about burnings. We are talking about the erasure of black or Arab or Asian intellectual thought, and it should be an obligation for university, even as a tool of reparation, to make sure that it is keeping alive or trying to resurrect or even actively seeking those remnants of history which have been destroyed or tampered with, but also that which is being produced now. It's not just about finding, things which have happened in the past and trying to piece together the scraps of destroyed objects. It's also BME authors today are writing fantastic things. Why can't we have, Chinua Achebe on our English literature reading list? Why can't we have authors from the global south and from different areas? That's my answer.
Yeah, just adding on from that, I think the curriculum itself is riddled with colonialism in a way that it's not just erasure, but in the way that the curriculum itself kind of positions Europe in this position that is so dominant in a way that it takes away the way writers from the global south have actually contributed to a lot, but also the fact that a lot of the literature and the scholarship that's been done by only positioning Europe and European writers on what it means to be human, what morality means, what history means, what what the disciplines that we're studying mean, at the same time not only erases the efforts, not just scholarship efforts and academic efforts, but actual real events. For example, the fact that at a time when, in the Enlightenment, when defining what means to be human is what rationality means, what morality means, and how that completely contradicts the way what it means to be human has been limited to the vision of what Kant and Nietzsche and other white philosophers have dictated to be. But then what happens when the Haitian Revolution happens, and that kind of at the time was seen as Haitian writers have said and historians have said, a non-event. They could not believe that black people are able to take destiny into their own hands and actually go right against what white people have imposed on them. To the point it's a non-event because it goes against that very narrow kind of pigeon-held view of what it means to be human, because they broke right through that by taking up matters in a way that it goes beyond what writers and philosophers have put through. And it's written in colonialism in a way that it still positions Europe when we're talking about decolonization, because decolonization is kind of still talking back at Europe, where we're trying to say that we're trying to like knock on a door and say, open the door so all these writers can also be included from the global south who have huge contributions to disciplines that that you have created or you think are the pinnacle of what scholarship and academia should be. But then within that itself, we need to take that away and actually see that we don't have to beg Europe for any sort of validation in any way, where we constantly have to talk back at them. The decolonization kind of reaffirms that in a way, but yeah, decolonizing the curriculum should be something where we liberate that completely, and we take away the position of Europe that has been centuries of just building it through, and take that away and kind of build up again from the point blank on a new scale.
From the English teaching point of view, I mean, we don't decolonize the curriculum at all until, I mean, recently we did. So we used to teach people like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and Purple Hibiscus, and I know an awful lot of schools used to teach her book and really, really celebrate the fact, and lots of pupils actually really enjoyed the fact that they were not doing some white old man dead for centuries, and they were doing something relevant and that they could identify with. And then we got Michael Gove, who thrust his views on us, and we were landed with, you know, the traditional canonical curriculum, because he thought that that was great and good and we should all do that. And actually it's a real shame, because there were writers that we used to do Achebe as well. He was on the curriculum, and A Rabbit Proof Fence was also on the syllabus for the GCSE, which looks at the Aboriginal people in Australia and the troubles that they had where they were all imprisoned. It was all just terrible. And so we did have a curriculum that was beginning to break through, but now it is all Dickens and Shakespeare, and it's all dead white men, really. Right. And it's, I mean, it's a real shame. And children did used to respond really impressively to having a variety of curriculum. And they are really good writers. I mean, it's ridiculous. People say, oh, you know, we've got to do the great and the good, and we've got to have all these people that, you know, everybody admires. But actually, these writers are very good writers, and it's ridiculous to say, no, we must only teach Dickens, we can't teach anybody else. It's madness.
Right. So it's sort of highly evident that colonialism is not an impulse from the past that sort of set out a canon and then was followed, but it's actually still a force that is impacting on the curriculum now.
It's an absolute force that is there. I mean, you know, because English teachers are completely constrained. I used to teach in Southall, where there were an awful lot of Asian writers, and we used to teach these Asian writers because we had more of a control over the curriculum. So we used to teach people like Anita Desai and Farouk Dondi and R.K. Narayan. And then the national curriculum came in, which was kind of controlling, and now it's got even more so. So the curriculum now, with Michael Gove, who wrote it, I mean, he actually penned it, is totally British, narrowly, squeezingly British, and it's not a good thing.
Okay, the question, it seems to me, has two parts. It's asking about universities and higher education, and it's asking about empire. So really what we're thinking about is the relationship between empire and knowledge, and the processes of empire and the processes of knowledge construction. I think diversity is a part of the process of decolonization, but there's a danger that we reduce decolonization to diversity. For me, bringing in writers from Africa or Asia is not something I'm doing because there are Asian or African people in the room. Decolonization, if anything, is more vital for the majority community than it is for ethnic minority communities. So I slightly, I think, dissent from the view that because Britain is multicultural in whatever sense, we must have a diverse curriculum, and that's what decolonization is. I think decolonization means asking more fundamental questions about how knowledge itself has been profoundly structured by the imperial project. And indeed, the very idea of the West, or the very idea of Britain as we know it, is coterminous with the coming into being of the British Empire and other European empires. So I think we need to ask more fundamental structural questions and not reduce it to a case of, well, you know, shall we put some Black and Asian writers or Black and Asian perspectives into the curriculum? My discipline, which is English, is very directly related to the colonial project. English as a discipline did not exist until civil servants had to sit an exam where they were then quizzed on literature. The assumption there was that literature was a way of disseminating English values in the colonies, and so British administrators who were going into the colonies had to do their share of Dickens and Keats and Byron and whoever else, precisely because they needed to be told what it meant to be English before they went out into the colonies. So in a way, it's not at all about Black and Asian students or readers. It's about the constitution of the idea of England, the idea of Greater Britain, and the whole concept of this society as it sees itself. So I would say that in terms of canon, in terms of archives, in terms of the relationship between power and knowledge, there are much more fundamental questions to be asked around decolonization that I think we need to sort of start teasing out.
Great.
I mean, actually, English as a subject predated the colonization thing. I mean, because people like Matthew Arnold, and actually in the dissenting schools, they all used to teach English as opposed to classics because they thought that they thought that people spoke, the ordinary people spoke English, and that actually English was a subject that was worth doing. And in the dissenting schools, they didn't teach classics, where, you know, the public schools did. Mm-hmm. They actually taught English because they thought it was the language of the people. That doesn't predate the colonial project. What you have in the 19th century is English seen as a subject that is okay for women, the working classes, and colonial administrators, and then is disseminated in. The colonial project is several hundred years old. So there's no way that Matthew Arnold predates the colonial project. But the dissenting schools, no, they don't. But the dissenting schools were like 18th century, which is possibly, I mean, it grew up as a subject. I agree, it didn't grow up as the subject that everybody did because they did classics, but other people did. So yeah, the working class and also the dissenters did. So.
Great, and I think we're ready to move on to the next question, which is much more in kind of practical terms. So practically, in two parts, what would it, A, take to decolonize education, and B, what do we think this would actually look like? Priya, would you like to start? We'll go this way then.
Okay. Well, I think that what we've been seeing at Cambridge and at other places in recent months it gives us a good sense of what it takes. I think it has been enormously helpful at Cambridge that the impetus came from students, because however much faculty members might say in meetings or in committees, there is nothing like students demanding that their education be rectified and that their education be differently done that makes a difference. So it's going to take continued student effort along with faculty allies. It is going to take more institutional commitment than we have seen thus far. It will need some modest allocation of resources to the project of the institution, divesting itself of colonial legacies and reforming itself. It will also take a commitment to the critical spirit, to a sense that this isn't just about appeasing the minorities, but that this is really asking, as I said, very fundamental questions about what a university is and what a university should be doing. So that the work of rereading and rethinking the curriculum is a joint project, and it can't be something that a small committee on diversity goes off and does in the corner. It absolutely has to be a shared project.
I was in Canada recently, and Canada theoretically counts as a colonial place, you know, and their writers, you know, Margaret Atwood and people like that, would count as colonial. Although, interestingly, when you go to Canada, the English teachers in Canada don't think of that at all. They have to teach Canadian literature, but interestingly, what they do is that they teach an awful lot of First Nation writers. So they are decolonising it in that way. And again, they are, you know, they are fascinating writers. When I went, I had never heard of half of these people, and I read them as part of the book that I was doing. And they write really, I mean, there was one book called The Indian Road by Richard Wagamati, which was a fascinating book all about the internment of children, which we know about in Australia, but also happened in Canada. And it was, you know, it was really horrific stuff, and they teach all this in Canadian schools, and I think that that is I think that that is part of the project. You look at how you can diversify. I think diversification is a very good thing, but also, actually, when we are teaching English in England, we teach Irish people, and Ireland was a colony. If you read Tom Paulin, he wrote a book called Irish and English. And he thinks that the English colonised the Irish people, so he thinks of James Joyce as, you know, an example of that. So those kind of things happen too. But I do think that I do think it is very worthwhile doing this.
Just adding on from everything that's already been said, I think the project is going to require a lot of commitment and constant reflection and re-examination of what we have taken as the status quo in front of us right now. For example, the issue of archives and which archives in history do we use and take and uphold as this is reliable enough for us to use in this kind of in this project or not. That comes into the issue of oral history. For example, I remember being asked in my interview, how would we know what Sudanese women who've really been experiencing colonialism if we have no documents or archives documenting their lives? And I told the interviewer, I have my grandmother's stories, who she told me for bedtime stories, and I feel like that should be upheld as actual archives and actual, the actual data that should be used, and it should not be questioned just as much as because the colonial administrator wrote about her at the same time. So it requires constant reflection and constant examination of what we have in front of us, because decolonization is a huge and holistic project that requires a lot of commitment from faculty, from students, from departments all throughout. It also I think it's going, what it looks like just in the other part of the question, it's going to require a very liberatory kind of view of what education means, because it also means while we're looking and talking about decolonization, we need to talk about the larger kind of apparatus and institution that kind of wraps the university and education as a whole. And with that, I'm specifically looking at PREVENT. PREVENT is a strategy that kind of, it's becoming more and more of a thought policing mechanism that's being imposed into the university. So while we're actually, so it's great, for example, in my course in HSPS and International Relation, it has been decolonized in the sense that we are constantly reflecting on the reading list, not just the reading list, but also the method of teaching is very critical of what things we take for granted. For example, in one paper, I look at the state, and then we have Fanon, we have Gandhi, and that's it. It's decolonized because we have a brown and a black writer talking about the state itself. But the other course, we have the one where actually interrogates the state within itself as an institution that is a colonial institution, and it derives from colonial reflections and encounters that white Europeans have constructed for themselves in order to oppress the global south during the colonial endeavors within itself. And I feel like that's a good way of going forward with it. But that's not going to go forward if we don't take away, for example, the larger mechanisms that are silencing groups of students, for example, Muslim students, where we can talk about decolonization, we decolonize this curriculum, and you can talk about how intervention in the Middle East is problematic, or settlements in the West Bank that you don't agree with, for example. But at the same time, you have your supervisor who might report you at the same time. So I feel like decolonization is a huge and holistic effort that doesn't just start and end with the reading list. It starts and ends with the institution of the university, especially Cambridge as a whole. And it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of reflection.
Yeah. Additionally, I do think that it also requires an interrogation of like how we study what we study. So, for example, if you were to label Bentham a racist, you might be said, well, that's anachronistic, you know, like these concepts don't exist at the time. I think some people seem to think that anti-racist thinking started with Martin Luther King, which is ridiculous. So if you took like Bentham's idea of, you know, like utilitarianism, greatest good for the greatest number, that sounds all well and good. But a lot of the time, you're not allowed to interrogate that further. You're not allowed to consider, like, so who does Bentham consider a person? And under this construction of like moral philosophy and who is considered a pure human and whose pleasures or pains are taken more into account, these kind of arguments are used to justify the colonization of people from countries like some of ours. And in which case, when we study someone like Bentham, we need to be making sure that we're not afraid to use these statements of like, this is racist because this had implications for people of this time who were not white people, because I often think that with decolonization, a lot of the time, as Priya said, everyone thinks it's about diversifying, about just having like, oh, let's have Fanon and let's have James Baldwin. But also, it's also about finding these white philosophers and be like, why are they trash? Why do we want to? It's not about, so what's irritating is that sometimes people say, you know, like, oh, why do you want to get rid of Shakespeare? No one wants to get rid of Shakespeare, but perhaps when we read Othello, perhaps we want to really dig into Othello and think about like how the racialization of Othello plays into the presentation of Moors within the society in which Shakespeare lived. And I think that those questions are already happening with Othello, but why can't they happen for a much broader base of writers? And I also think in terms of like what we study too, a lot of the time we actually need to decolonization in the way, because like a lot of decolonial writing, well, allegedly decolonial writing, which comes from often, so take for example, in my gender paper, I was learning about like white Western feminists who study third world women and the way in which they essentialize women and make all sorts of assumptions about their agency. So for example, you might read a white feminist text which speaks about Somali women and speaks about Somali women as totally oppressed, whereas the experiences of Somali women might be different. There might be like an aristocracy and an underclass. There might be experiences which vary dependent on like queerness, on location, which are contingent on like very different, varied and individual experiences. But the white feminist author would have you believe, oh yeah, all Somali women are just oppressed. They live in this like patriarchal country where they are like forced to wear hijabs or they're forced to wear this and that. And to them, that's decolonial writing because they're writing about black and brown people, which is ridiculous. So I think interrogating that mode of study and making sure that we're expanding our minds and expanding what we consider legitimate questions. And with regard to legitimate questions, picking up Alina's point about prevent, the Home Office prevent strategy, the way in which it is used as an intervention to discipline people for expanding their thoughts, for asking these difficult questions, is something which is a disgrace in this country and is something which the institution upholds. And the way in which the institution upholds this is by when students are organizing, when students are bringing in certain speakers, it means like, who is that speaker? They're a brown person, they come from this country, they have these different views, that might be suspicious. So that we know that Cambridge Palestinian Society was holding a panel. Because the chair of the panel was someone, I think from King's College London, was a Muslim woman, they replaced them with someone neutral. The neutral person was a white academic. Why is whiteness seen as neutrality? And also, why is neutrality so celebrated? Why was it so bad for there to be a Muslim speaker there? And when we think about thought policing, even institutions like the Cambridge Union too. So when we think about like platforming too, and I want to bring this to the issue of what kind of intellectual thought or what kind of thought is seen as valid. For the union to have someone like Katie Hopkins, if you were to have an Islamic preacher who held that same extremity of views, you'd probably be arrested and you'd probably be interrogated under Home Office present strategy. So when we think about the institutions being complicit, I'm going to add the Cambridge Union too. It's not just the University of Cambridge, it's also institutions within. It's when you're deciding to platform speakers who have certain despicable views about trans lives, about queer lives, about marginalized people's lives, speakers who are talking about, you know, shooting migrants with gunboats, you allow this thought and you see this as valid because it comes from white people, but you do not allow someone to say that's racist. That's me.
Well, our current vice president and future president are in the room, so I hope they're listening. I'd just like to ask on a little tangent. Both Priya and Jason touched on limits on the sort of questions that can be asked and boundaries essentially around sort of our ontology as a student body. Can everyone just sort of give a personal example, if they have one, of limits on questions and questions that they have wanted to ask that have not been allowed. And also perhaps touch on what might have to happen institutionally for those questions to be put forward without being limited.
Who would you like to, sorry, are you asking?
Anyone can
Anyone.
start.
Yeah, okay. A deathly silence.
Honest thought.
I mean, I train people to become teachers. I hope there are people out there who will become teachers. And we discussed the PREVENT strategy. I mean, the PREVENT strategy is one of the things that we talk about, and we dissect it and look at it from a very different point of view. So when we are asked, because, you know, the government says you've got to discuss the PREVENT strategy, and so we have a lecture on the PREVENT strategy, and we have to tick everybody to make sure that they're there, which shows the kind of control that they have over us, because, you know, if Ofsted come knocking on our door, we've got to show that all our students have been at the PREVENT strategy. However, we have seminars that follow it, and even the lecture looks at the PREVENT strategy and says, actually, this is nonsense. It's a kind of racist document, and we dissect it and turn it around. So that we are all constrained in some ways, and yet not in others, because we have the power to discuss as well as follow the rules, if you see what I mean. I mean, you know, we do have to follow the rules, and therefore we are constrained, but we have a degree of agency as well, and we challenge things.
Why do we have to follow the rules?
Because if we don't, we would lose our jobs. And the King's College course would shut down, because if Ofsted came and we showed that, I mean, I would really like not to follow the rules of Ofsted. I resent them, and
But isn't it something of a kind of fantasy to think that if you follow the rules, but you follow it up by a seminar, then that's fine. We've sort of done our little indulgence, and we are okay because we showed we're critical, but we carry on doing what we're being asked to do, even when it is manifestly wrong.
Yes, there is that to it. And yet the PREVENT strategy exists, and teachers have to confront what the PREVENT strategy is all about. And in the lecture, they don't play, you know, they are not subservient to the strategy, and we have a lot of discussions.
But you are describing a situation where you're saying we have no choice but to be subservient.
Yes, that is true. We have to, you know, we are required, there is a ruling that says you are required to teach the PREVENT strategy, and therefore we do have to teach the PREVENT strategy, which is not right. I agree with you. I completely agree with what you're saying. And that is our way round it. It is not adequate. I admit that it is not adequate, but nevertheless, it is a challenge to the PREVENT strategy. I mean, the PREVENT strategy exists, and it is the law. And so, you know, in theory, well, no, we have to obey the law, but we can challenge the mechanics of it, which we do.
To kind of, I mean, to go back to the basics of Jay's question, do either of you two have any examples of questions you specifically wanted to ask in your studies that you felt you couldn't, or you actually you couldn't?
I mean, Lena touched on being reported by your supervisor.
No, I didn't say I got reported. I was like, that's a fear in my mind as a Muslim student when I'm writing about 9/11, when I'm writing about terrorism, which is part of my course. Yeah. And I'm very glad that it is. And the way we interrogate those issues has been great in terms of like the course in itself. But when I'm writing that, and at the same time, I have to write that, I have to follow a certain argument that if I believe it in, the reading list is there as well. For example, I do think that intervention in the Middle East has been problematic. The next day, a screenshot of the PREVENT strategy and the training that's on Moodle has a bunch of bullet points right there of things that I study myself. A bullet point that says students who show some sort of opposition to intervention in the Middle East, or opposition to settlement in the West Banks, or or the US government as a whole, then at the same time, I'm worried about the things I'm Googling.
Yeah.
I'm worried about my webcam. I'm worried about the things right there. That is a personal experience of mine. Did I want to ask my supervisor if they would report me? I wish I could. That's one of the things I can't ask as well as a Muslim student. Are you going to report me for this essay, or am I okay? And that's not something that should be on my mind at all to begin with. Another question that I've always wanted to ask is in one of my papers when we were studying, I remember this distinctly, we were studying Constant, and Constant basically argues that in modern states will never have to fight for wealth because they can just sit down and have a civilized conversation with one another and then they can trade. It was like, man, you're writing at the same time France was colonizing half the world and literally using slave trade to do exactly that. And I wanted to raise my hand because that was a session when the lecturer gave a platform to ask questions. I did want to raise my hand and ask about that, but I couldn't because I am not one, but one of the very few students of color or students who have that in mind in a sea of white students who probably have never even thought of that. So that is definitely something that is the fault of the curriculum itself for not considering it. And also Hobbes and the fact that Hobbes is held as this he gave us everything, well, he did it, and the mental gymnastics we have to go through, not we, but the lecturers and the reading list itself has to go through in order to prove that Hobbes was actually democratic. He was not, right. And kind of completely gloss over the fact that he says some pretty very racist things about Native Americans in order to further his argument for what a Leviathan, a sovereign is. I want to ask that in the middle of the lecture. I want to ask that to make it more clear within the lecture, but kind of the weight of it, because the whiteness of the curriculum is within itself a huge weight that's standing on students like me and Jason, for example. And that is not a weight that we should carry, and that is not a weight that we should feel should silence us within those spaces.
I think, thinking about like a personal experience, so when I was in sixth form, I studied classics at A-level. And I remember reading Herodotus, and I don't know how much people know about Herodotus, but not great. So Herodotus is the histories. It looks at the Peloponnesian Wars, and basically in this narrative of the Greeks versus the Persians, so maybe if you watch 300. So within the text, a lot of the discussion of the Persians focused on like long flowing hair and like sensuality and oils and perfume, and was meant to like basically feminize the Persians as these like weak enemies who use weak weapons and were basically just all sissies. That was kind of the implication behind that. And I remember my classics teacher used to just roar with laughter at these different depictions. And I used to interrogate and be like, do you not think this is perhaps like quite an exoticized or even anti-queer depiction of Persian people? And he just thought, it's just a text. It's just classics. Like, there was no real interrogation of the fact that, so even when we look at how Edward Said looks at how, like, Western fetishization of the Orient and of Asian cultures, particularly, facilitate this kind of feeling of entitlement over defining the other, and the way in which, like, British colonialism, so colonial histories for, like, for the East are kind of different for the South, in that when we think about colonial histories in the East, there's one of exploitation, but it's one in the sense of like preserving things for the sake of using them for luxury. So the idea, so even things like tea. So the fact that the idea that like, oh, like tea has come from India or whichever country, these countries were seen as like so like luxurious and indulgent that like British people wanted to just steal things from there and take things and like put them in their museums. And I kind of thought when I was reading that text, like, you know, how does this kind of like proto-colonial thinking about like, you know, the exotic people who like do engage in all these like whatever activities, like how does that translate into the modern day? So, for example, if we then look at like Foucault, so I actually really love Foucault, but in his history of sexuality, he acts as if the Kama Sutra is this like seminal text in Hinduism which like informs all understandings of sexuality. When I remember like Indians who spoke as me had been like, the Kama Sutra is, in terms of like Hindu spirituality, is not as important as a lot of other texts. I can't claim to know them myself because I am not of that religion, I have not studied them. But the way in which like the Kama Sutra or something is like fetishized, it's like, oh, look at these like different positions and look at like the sexuality and sensuality of the Indian people. So in reading Herodotus and looking at like that exoticization of Persian people, why was I not allowed to then connect that to colonial violence today? Why was I not able to map that as a trend of perception of people from the East? Why is that not seen as a valid question of inquiry? Why is that just dismissed as, oh, it's just classics though? It's just the text. That's just what Herodotus wrote. That's just what the Greeks thought. Why is there no interrogation to racialized thinking? Anytime you discuss racialized thinking of anyone pre like 1960, it's like, well, you know, come on. that can't be the case. That's just how things were. Everything is taken as an anachronism, as if racism was born yesterday, or as if, like, even if these things didn't have language, as if these ideas didn't pre-exist. The way in which this relates to us as students today means that we never know, like, can I actually interrogate this text? Can I say, maybe this white writer writes in this really exclusionary way because he only wants other white people to read and understand it? A lot of the time when I'm reading some of these white sociologists and philosophers, I haven't got a fucking clue what they're talking about. And that's the point. They actually don't want me to have a fucking clue what I'm talking about because I am a black student. Their writing is not made for people like us. And that's why a lot of the time when people speak, when people kind of like, so I remember one thing actually. So I'm on my like junior party committee at Pembroke College as the BME officer, and I remember I went into like a library committee meeting to talk about like the provision of like books from authors who are non-white and trying to like include that provision. And then obviously the guy was like, but they would have to be held to the same standard as all of the other texts, and I'm not sure about the quality of some of those books from the global south, as you say, which was like obviously like incredibly offensive, but also sometimes the idea is that like the simplicity in terms of writing in language of authors who are non-white is seen as a problem. It's seen as like, if it's not really complex and if there are not words they understand, then oh, it's just not intellectual work. And it's like, why is that the case? Why is it that what we consider to be intellectual work and to be intellectually worthy is dependent on this really white Western European language, which actually is written to exclude? So even someone who tends to escape criticism, but Judith Butler, as much as Judith Butler's Gender Trouble is seminal, it is important in the establishment of our deconstruction of gender, actually what Judith Butler says in Gender Trouble isn't anything that like black, queer and trans ballroom artists or people like Harlem and New York have been saying about gender for ages, but because they're saying it in African-American vernacular, it's not seen as important to the academy unless it's being studied through this kind of like fetishizing anthropological lens. So like, why would my venture into like the way in which like black and queer artists and like performers have deconstructed gender, why must that only be done in like Room 101 where I'm studying it through like a Paris is Burning documentary shot by like Jenny Livingston, I think her name is, where she's like, has these like bodies on show and like displaying them and being like, oh, look at the exotic people and how they deconstruct gender. Why is it that when I write an essay, I've got to refer to Judith Butler for my deconstruction of gender? Why is that considered the thought which is important, the thought which is valid? Why must it only be that which has been committed to paper? Why could I not perhaps go out into my community, discuss my community's deconstructions of gender and queerness, and bring that to my essay? Why must it be, you know, this white person, that white person? So I think the pools of resources in which we grant our knowledge is something which, as a student, I felt like I've been invalidating from having using resources which are not conventional. So like, as Lena said, like, why could I not draw on my grandmother's experiences and her testament? It's like, oh, because you think that because it hasn't come from this specific canon, that it's not important or it's not valid. And I think we need to interrogate why that is.
Thank you very much. So we've already touched on a few reasons that are typically, if I can put it this way, given against decolonisation. Would the panel like to outline any more of those?
So just kind of what lies behind the backlash or the kind of resistance by the university to truly embrace all the steps that you lined up that it would need to take in order to fully kind of change the English curriculum the way it needs to be?
I don't know that I would say that there is a kind of simple resistance. I think that there is some willingness to address questions, but perhaps not a willingness that goes far enough. But the reasons that come up frequently, one of them articulated by somebody who used to be at Cambridge, that to bring black and minority ethnic writers into the curriculum is to give it an artificial balance, as though to bring in, as though to kind of hollow out and fill in the contours of knowledge was a kind of suspect project because it meant that the real writers and thinkers were going to be written out. You also often get the argument that it's anachronistic to talk about race or colonialism in the context of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and that's, again, based on a certain kind of ignorance. It is not the case that everybody in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries thought in exactly the same way about race. There are huge differences between, let us say, Dickens on the one hand and someone like E.M. Forster on the other, or between Conrad on the one hand and Virginia Woolf on the other. There are dissident traditions in Britain as well, so that this argument that you frequently hear that, oh, you know, to talk about race or gender or sexuality in centuries other than our own is somehow anachronistic, that itself is based on a kind of false and homogenizing understanding of what Britain itself is. You also very often hear this kind of sense that to bring in writers from elsewhere, to bring in marginalized writers involves a dilution of standards, or the flip side of that is to say, well, actually, they're just as good as Shakespeare or Jane Austen. And I think that's also a problem, that kind of position of benevolence from which inclusion is enacted. I think that being a good writer or being a good thinker can be very, very different kinds of things. And that actually we shouldn't be really saying, well, there is one way in which to be good, and if a person meets that criterion, then we can include them in the curriculum. But I also think we see a great deal of anxiety about relinquishing privilege. So when the whole affair with decolonizing the English curriculum and the Telegraph saying, oh, this means that white men are going to be, you know, thrown off the curriculum, the idea that recentering marginalized perspectives means some form of white cultural genocide, that sensational idea, I think, has a lot of play, and it has play in ways that are really quite puzzling, and that really have to do with an unwillingness to give up any form of privilege, any form of dominance whatsoever. And I think these are some of the arguments that you run into quite frequently.
I think also the argument is that you should teach children cultural capital. Cultural capital has an awful lot of sway, particularly in the school curriculum, possibly in the university's curriculum too, but I know more about the school curriculum, and the idea of cultural capital having power, and that children should learn the culture, you know, children who are so-called disadvantaged ought to come to the great and the good and learn all these people, because if they don't have this cultural capital, then they are doubly disadvantaged. And I think also that's behind the so-called knowledge curriculum as well. The knowledge curriculum is one that espouses cultural capital, and it's very much pushed by a man called E.D. Hirsch, who lives in the States, but an awful lot of his thinking has come over into this country, and there are schools set up that do E.D. Hirsch's curriculum. Their curriculum is really strange, actually. It's very odd. They teach the so-called canonical text, but actually it's very determined by what individual teachers like, but still they are, you know, the so-called canonical writers. And I think that that's wrong in two ways. One, cultural capital shifts all the time. So, you know, the Telegraph readers have cultural capital, so they think, and then suddenly it will shift. So, for example, children across the UK started to do far better in their GCSEs, and then so they thought, well, then they must be getting much easier to do. And the English curriculum actually never was getting easier to do. Teachers taught to the test, and they got kids through. But actually what they were having to do was really quite complicated. And so they shifted it and said, oh, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Now we're going to do something else. And that was what Michael Gove said. We're going to make them much harder. So the arguments around cultural capital shift. And two, we are living in a post-colonial world, and so it's ridiculous to say we've got to hang on to these treasured, you know, white dead men, because actually the world has moved on, and we are living in a post-colonial world, and we ought to, you know, read far more widely than this, you know, treasured group of people who write in this sceptred isle, I think. So I think that, you know, it's a very important thing to do.
I would say the backlash comes from lack of understanding of what decolonization actually means, just the word and kind of like the connotation that's come with it. So whenever I did approach academics and lecturers about decolonization, the immediate reaction I would get before I even kind of explain what decolonization is, yeah, but these privileged white men that you hate so much, they have a lot to contribute to what we're studying. We need to study morality, so therefore we need to study Kant. I was like, I'm not saying stop studying Kant. I'm saying let's study how Kant's conception of race, and the fact that he might have as well been one of the first people during the Enlightenment to bring the idea of race and the idea of blackness, and how that plays into his idea of morality, and the fact that morality is a white man's virtue versus the black man's lack of morality. That brings us actually a much more holistic and deep understanding of Kant, if need be, and other philosophers who followed the same thing. We're not saying take them away, which is, I feel like Priya mentioned as well, there's like this great kind of like attack on the white man's property is within the media these days a lot, and we see it as well in the idea that white working class boys are doing so bad in education, and the fact that just now we realize that white working class boys are doing so badly in education, just now when Bangladeshi students are doing slightly a little bit, 1% better than them in the general GCSE performance, and kind of like this huge white backlash to the decolonization without any understanding of what it really means. It's like it's not an attack on you specifically, but at the same time it is an attack on the position that white people and Europe have been taking for so long, and what that actually means for the global South in general. It's not just adding in within it, it's understanding within itself what decolonization is. So yeah, and within that comes a very, very ugly reflection and interrogation of those writers that we cherish so much. When you find out Hobbes is a racist, a lot of Pol I students aren't going to be very comfortable because they love him. And it's like, and when you find out through that actually whiteness and your identity as a white person, your identity as European, inherently is very oppressive even today, because we don't live in a post-colonial world. Colonialism does exist until now in very invisible and delirious and violent ways in our most intimate lives even. But when we actually confront that within the curriculum where you're supposed to write an essay on it, it's not easy to swallow. So yeah, I feel like that's part of the reason why we have a backlash to decolonization.
I think looking at, so because you guys have articulated the kind of like academic backlash so well, I think also we shouldn't be afraid to like expose and discuss the way in which this is just linked to like whiteness and fragility too. So like when the scandal concerning decolonizing Cambridge blew up in the press in October, November, a lot of people was just there, you know, like, why should they be studying this, that, blah, blah. And I kind of thought, what's it got to do, what do you care what students at Cambridge are studying? You don't go there. Your children don't go there. What's it got to do with you? But the issue is, as stated, it's about the white man's property. It's about this idea that, you know, these minorities are coming to these institutions and taking it over. It's this idea of like a cultural invasion. It's this idea of people like me coming and taking your places. It feeds into the same narratives which we have had with Brexit. It feeds into this, like, I think we should understand the resistance to decolonization from the general public as part of this same, like, general, like, anti-migrant, anti-brown and black people, so like this very like racist discourse which like exists in this country, and I don't think we should be afraid to like place resistance to decolonization underneath that, because like we can all sit here and give you every single intellectual argument about why Kant is a racist, why Hobbes is a racist, why Judith Butler is not that good, but at the end of the day, some people just simply don't want to listen. And no matter how much labor and how much laboring and how much intellectual thought that we produce as a collective, that's not going to matter to some people who are just keen to dismiss it. And that's why I think that when we are trying to like push for decolonization in institutions, we need to expect backlash, because every single political movement which is in some way anti-racist, which is in some way anti-colonial, does receive this backlash. And whatever intellectual thought we produce, some people simply don't care. They're going to hear it, they're going to consider it, or they're not going to consider it at all, because the problem is my property, my country, my Britain. My whiteness is at stake. And it's because with like people in this population, whenever they feel at all compromised in their position, made to feel disoriented, made to feel that 1% of discomfort which like marginalized people experience every day in their lives, they react with such violence and with such vitriol, and they act as if they're the oppressed one. So moving away even just from like the intellectual and academic thought, that is why there is so much resistance, because this country is very, very racist.
I think that it might be best now, so that while we still have time, to open a little bit to the floor, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask or add. Do we have a mic? Yes?
You've got a mic here as well.
Oh, so many mics.
Social anthropology supervision recently, I raised to my supervisor the fact that the core tenets of the discipline, so things like kinship, gift exchange, sexuality, marriage, all of these are in some way linked to a colonial project, because that is the historical context of the rise of the discipline itself. And I put to my supervisor on that basis that no amount of rejigging of the reading list can get away from the fact that the entire foundation of the discipline is built on a colonial legacy, and therefore, in my eyes, for it to have any real relevance, you have to go back and reconsider those core tenets from a perspective that isn't founded on colonialization. So I was wondering whether the panel thinks that we've kind of hit a stumbling block where, you know, just to elaborate more on what Priya was saying, that we think that just with rejigging some reading lists, we're going to get to where we want to be, or do we actually need to be questioning the very subjects and the kind of more structural aspects of those subjects that we're learning at Cambridge and other universities, and, you know, subjecting those to some more critical analysis?
I think when we, looking at subjects like social anthropology, I think when we actually get the right type of criticism of that subject, that can be very productive. So if we look at Clifford Geertz, he talks about the myth of the chameleon man who can go into like different tribes and cultures and make these like supposedly objective analyses of them. Geertz is quite good in determining that like every person is like informed, every person, there is no like neutrality. So like a lot of the time the academy and white men particularly try to claim this neutrality, that they can go into these cultures and just make comments about everything that's going on and nothing about that is informed by themselves, because white people are seen as so pure that they do not have any kind of biases. And Geertz is like, this is ridiculous, of course you're informed by bias. So when you look at like these models of like, if you're looking at like models of like kinship in Kenya or whatever, these white writers will just write and speak about like, you know, this is what happened and this happens for this reason. And actually that's something which actually like tends to function on an everyday level. So if we also think about like decolonizing feminist practice, a lot of the time people will like oversubscribe meaning to a lot of actions which people like partake in. So if we take, for example, people in my culture, so like Nigerian women, so after the death of a husband, so for like Yoruba women, after the death of the husband, a woman might shave her head or like not wear makeup for a year. So a white feminist writer or social anthropologist looking at that culture might be like, and this, you know, links to this like one tradition of this ancient time, or maybe that's just what people do. Like often this kind of like oversuspicion and like over-analysis of different cultures and this attempt to like fit it within this like very specific academic framing, and it's kind of like intellectual masturbation, which often happens when people are studying cultures which are not their own, in social anthropology but also in other disciplines, is something which needs to be disseminated. And actually it does mean a lot of people getting fired, because a lot of people are just chatting a lot of rubbish, talking about this culture and that culture and like what this does and that does, and actually have no idea what they're talking about.
I just want to say two things. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that these are very fundamental structural questions, and they need to be asked. I don't, however, see them as a stumbling block or as a kind of contradiction which ends the project. I think it's important when we recognize injustice and oppression and the scale of it, not to thereby also reify Western white agency. Knowledge has always been a human project. It's always been a project that has required currents from across the world. So although anthropology may have come into being as a colonial discipline, or English literature may have come into being for specific social purposes, knowledge is not bounded. So I don't, and this is where I dissent from the people who talk about epistemicide and so on, who have a notion that there are kind of separate categories of knowledge, and then there is black knowledge, and then there is white knowledge, or there is Indian knowledge, and then there's British knowledge. What we know about human culture is that language itself is a process of constant flows. Knowledge is built by the exchange of ideas. So when my former teacher, Martin Bernal, wrote Black Athena, the classics as a discipline really reacted against that book, because one of the things he was saying is that European knowledge and European ideas have been heavily influenced by Africa, that Africa was in many ways the progenitor of certain ideas which are now being passed off as Western. So I think that we need to be careful, even as we identify the depths and the scale of oppression and injustice, not to therefore think of, paradoxically concede all agency to the West and say, well, we've got to start all over again because this is all Western and tainted. What we actually have to tease out are the ways in which what is passed off as Western knowledge was never Western to begin with, that the West itself was constituted on false exclusions. It involved, for instance, throwing Muslims out of the body of Europe, literally and intellectually. And I think what we need to do is not a rejection, but a reconstruction.
I think, yeah, we had another question over here.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you for all of your brilliant contributions. Just drawing on a theme brought up in the panel about the ways that the relationship between knowledge and empire and decolonization has to be embedded in wider kind of systems of power. Just wondering what panelists think about how we need to think about the distribution of resources in relation to decolonization in the university. So whether that's about the kind of historical and current monopolization of resources at an institution like Cambridge, whether that's about the direction of resources that are under sort of such universities' control towards companies that participate in sort of processes that involve the destruction of knowledge, like the current climate crisis, or whether that's even about kind of the processes of marketization that are resulting in a kind of impoverishment and a lack of resources and time, even to the people who are working within the university to decolonize.
I think I completely agree. Decolonization, I feel like the conversation so far has been decolonization within the university without actually looking at Cambridge and Cambridge's position historically and contemporarily within the larger world, and the fact that decolonization happens, and the fact that someone once said that a lot of the research done here in science departments and engineering departments is being taken to feed into the US military-industrial complex, and then that feeds into the war on terror, and then that's destructing the knowledge in the libraries that have been destructed in Iraq, for example, during the Iraq invasion. And that is a much, much bigger kind of project that we should be looking at when we're looking at decolonization. We need to look at Cambridge's position within the city of Cambridge, which has just been declared the most unequal in the whole country, and what that position with itself puts other people of color within the country as a whole. Where does Cambridge's position put kids trying to study and trying to get their education in East London or in central Birmingham or in Bradford? Where are those children going into, and what's their trajectory going to be like because of Cambridge's position? It might not be visible and direct and right in front of us. You won't find an article about it online in The Guardian. It's so invisible and so subtle that we probably will never ever, when we realize that it's happened, it's going to be like, the impact of it's going to be so deep. So I do agree that divestment and the amount of money that Cambridge has invested in God knows what, that's suppressing God knows who as well. So I feel like, yeah, decolonization is a much, much bigger project that goes beyond, not just beyond the reading list, it goes beyond the university physically as a place locally and with and the privileged position that we occupy. Cambridge as a whole, historically until now, engages in knowledge production, in actual physical violence that is impacting people around the world. That we need decolonization should be, and the narrative and the discourse on decolonization should be central around that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to the panel. I too have a practical question. Faced with this hefty intellectual and emotional labor that needs to extend beyond the university, as you mentioned, where could, and with careers on the line, where could allies potentially lie? What solidarities could be formed, perhaps within the wider educational community at different levels of education, right through primary, or civil society organizations working for racial equality? Where could alliances be formed from sort of within the university and beyond the university and in between?
I think that Cambridge has a problem in that it is seen as a very white, privileged place. And if you're looking at the wider community, many people don't apply to Cambridge even though they have the results that could get them there because they see it as elitist, which is not necessarily anything other than just straight elitism. So suffers that they don't have many working class people coming here. They don't have many people from ethnic minorities coming here. They, you know, I mean, it's seen as an incredibly elitist place to go, so that if you have the grades, you don't go. And I think that is something that Cambridge needs to consider. I think also you have an interview system which privileges a certain way of doing things, so that if you come from a particular class, you are more at ease with the way in which people interview you than if you don't. And I think that also hinders people, so that you get people applying to Cambridge from, say, a working class background who don't actually get in, which again reinforces the opinion that it's elitist. So it's not just about clever people, it's about a certain type of clever person. And I think that is a real disadvantage to Cambridge in general, and that does need to change, and you need to get more people coming to Cambridge that are not part of that elite. I mean, you know, the number of kids who come from public schools, it's, you know, it's almost half, I think, and those who come from state schools predominantly come from grammar schools. So the number who actually come from, you know, an ordinary comprehensive is small in and of itself.
Or very highly Ofsted-rated state schools.
Yes, very highly Ofsted-rated schools. So there's a school in Ealing which is very highly rated, and they see themselves. But I think schools have to see themselves more or less as grammar schools, and even the kids who go to Cambridge tend to come from a middle-class background. So very, very few children who are not of, you know, white and middle class, even if they come from a comprehensive, get to Cambridge at all. I mean, I know one child who did come to Cambridge, and her father was Ghanaian, and she was a friend of my daughter's, and she really, I mean, she actually really, she didn't dislike it, but she really struggled when she came here, because it's a I mean, I'm one of the few white people, I'm the only white person on the panel, but I would be in the majority if I were in Cambridge, and that, I think, is a huge, huge disadvantage to children coming to thinking of Cambridge, and the view of it amongst ordinary people.
Just on the idea, the actual process of allyship, it is hard work, and just within the context of PREVENT, it needs actual white, able-bodied allies to take up this fight, okay? Because me as a Muslim student taking up the fight for PREVENT, within 48 hours, the feds are gonna get me, I'm gone. It needs, I can't be out here going up to my college and asking them to disclose to me all the times PREVENT has directly or indirectly impacted Muslim students within my college. I will be questioned in a dark room about it, probably, most probably. What my JCR white president could do is actually take up that fight and go interrogate the college more about it and ask them more about what's happening. And that's exactly the kind of allyship that we need from white able-bodied students here, taking it up and challenging whenever it comes up, taking it up institutionally as well. When it comes to things, showing up to meetings, learning more about PREVENT, because the amount of times I said the word PREVENT and the white person in front of me didn't know what PREVENT was is worrying, because I have to know about it, because the anxiety is always within me when I'm writing my essays, when I'm walking down the street, when I'm on my phone. It's like there needs to be an actual active work where white able-bodied students are there taking up the issue, and that involves actual labor where you show up to the meetings, you educate yourself what PREVENT is, you challenge your supervisor, you challenge it locally, because PREVENT is so decentralized, because Cambridge is also decentralized, and that's one of the bad things about it. But that's the thing, it needs to be challenged, it needs to be taken up. Email your senior tutors, guys.
I think also with regard to alliances, when we think about like different campaigns, so for example, like Cambridge Zero Carbon and the Crucible Me campaign recently collaborated on a project which looked at like divestment and like climate racism and like how climate change contributes to the facilitation of like poor circumstances, the poor outcomes for marginalized, racially marginalized communities. And I think that in looking at like, say, so I don't know much about the divestment projects myself, but in looking at like how projects can perhaps like form alliances within the university and exterior to the university, I think, as Dina said, it requires a lot of hard work. It requires a lot of collaboration. It requires like knowing like, so who is the best person to speak to like the university council, to speak to like the university body, the vice chancellor, whatever, about the kind of like projects going on. Which students are best to like answer these questions and interrogate these people. So like, it couldn't be someone like me or Lena, because we're in that office, in the dark room, getting slapped, whatever. Question, interrogation. Like, which students are best to be taking on their heavy work for these campaigns? And I think with the question of alliances, it's something I thought about myself, which I actually don't have an answer to. Like, how do our like individual campaigns actually make alliances outside of ourselves, outside of the university, and stop? And sometimes I actually think this might be a problem with Cambridge activism, which I'm willing to accept with the criticism, in that we are focus on the institution, and perhaps we are like not engaged enough with like the wider Cambridge community. So if I'm speaking about like the experiences of like racialized people within Cambridge, and I'm only speaking about students, what about the racialized members of the community? What about the way in which like, if Cambridge is like the most unequal city, and I'm talking about inequality in my campaigns, and I'm doing that here like literally in a castle, is that ridiculous? What kind of alliances can I form with different people outside of the community? How can we share resources? How can I share resources with them too? How hypocritical would it be for me to speak about like the way in which like institutions like hoard resources and don't share them out, if I actually have these resources in a position of privilege attending this institution and don't share them with people who live next to me just because they don't come under the University of Cambridge? So I actually think that's a good question. I think it's something that we don't think about enough, because I don't have the answer to it when I think I should.
One more question?
Yeah, I think we have a final question of the
Hi,
evening.
thank you. I just wanted to come back to the point of prevent, and I guess about allies. Obviously, it's really important, as you say, for students to be involved in prevent and what prevent is, and even like people using it in their campaigns, which is a bit sketchy. But what about teachers and staff of the university? You know, why did Bethan say that you can't go against the law because it is a rule? If it was something that was affecting a white majority or just a majority in this country, and it was a form of injustice in that sense, I'm pretty sure everyone would be willing to break the rule or the law. And I think there's that feeling of, oh, you know, I'm doing my bit because I can say that I don't agree with it, or, you know, I've heard teachers say myself, they know it's rubbish, but they have to comply with it. But why do you have to? You know, we're not questioning that, and we're here in this guise of, yes, justice, I support decolonisation, I support Muslim students, but you don't unless you make an actual statement and you are taking action. And I don't think it's enough for it to just be students. And just as students are supporting members who are on strike right now, staff and teachers need to show that same kind of support to Muslim students.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I agree with everything that you've said. I think that with the prevent strategy, I mean, it just happens to be the law, and therefore we discussed at great length whether or not we should do this, and whether or not we should mark the students, you know, do an attendance register. And actually what we've done is we've done an attendance register with all the lectures, so it's not singled out, but that's the one that counts, and we have to submit it. And so I think it is wrong. We then do deconstruct the prevent strategy at length. We have teachers in who have got into trouble for discussing the prevent strategy. So in religious education, we've got a teacher who with his class, deconstructed the whole thing and said, you know, is this right? And actually got into trouble, but then we defended him. So we do defend people who do it actively as well, so who question it. I suppose you're right. Maybe we should say, no, we're not going to do this, and make a stand of it. And that's another strategy that we could do. We haven't done that as yet. And I might take that back to my colleagues and say, look, actually, I was there, and this person said that we should stand against it, and maybe that's what we should do. Up till now, we have not. But it is a good idea.
I think I want to make a quick point. I think when we think about which students are being interrogated by prevent, so obviously the students being interrogated by prevent are like overwhelmingly racialized students, but also mainly like Muslim students too. But actually something I actually think about a lot, which perhaps people don't agree with, is like, why aren't more white students being interrogated? Because actually some of the things I've heard coming out of some people's mouths, I'm kind of like, you should be in jail.
Oh,
Some
yeah.
of the things some of the things that people have said and they have gotten away with, and the prevent duty apparently doesn't apply to them.
Actually, it does. So white extremism, theoretically, is covered by it.
That is a tokenized gesture that's
I,
put
I,
in there.
I realise that, but we make that clear. No, it is. I mean, absolutely.
Theoretically, it is covered by it. If it was actually properly covered by it, whoever was responsible for getting Katie Hopkins in there should be in jail. If it was proper, because as far as I'm concerned, if you were able to platform white supremacist speakers who are anti-queer, speakers who are racist, you are invested in a system of violence which makes conditions unsafe for marginalised students like myself and Nina. So where's your interrogation? Where's you in the wet room, you know, in the dark room, whatever, being interrogated by this guy? And I actually think that often we need to flip the question on its head, because I've met some white supremacists at university who have said despicable things, who hold despicable thoughts. Some people will be like, oh, well, colonialism was good because, you know, those barbaric people, they needed that. But if someone was to say, like, a parallel statement being like, well, I think people need Islam because, like, this country is wayward, which one is going to jail? Which one is going to jail? Or who's getting interrogated by the prevent strategy? I think actually sometimes we actually genuinely need to flip that question on its head, because like anything that marginalized students do, we're literally on our tiptoes trying to strip it back just as much as we can so that we're not getting into trouble. But white students can mouth off. They're theoretically come under the prevent duty, even though like the online radicalization of white men particularly is something which I've actually experienced firsthand. So in a period where I was getting trolled, I was getting like neo-Nazi symbols, I was getting F off nigger, I was getting people say, you know, like, I'm gonna come to your home and like rape your mother and enslave your family and things like that. And it's like, so where's the prevent duty for these people? Because these people aren't just, you know, like some anonymous person like hiding in their basement. Actually, some of them are your fellow classmates too. Some of them are even your lecturers and teachers. I've heard of people who've gone I've heard of someone who went into like a biological anthropology supervision, a black student, and the supervisor there was making comparisons between her and the white students and saying, oh, yeah, your form is more like the monkey or like this kind of like figure, whereas like the white students are more like this kind of figure. So why isn't that supervisor then also placed under prevent duty himself for this kind of like dehumanization of black people? Why does that, yeah, I just get frustrated because the question is always about like, you know, like how do we respond to like racialized people, what we can do. It's like, well, I actually think some white people need to be interrogated.
So here's the thing white allies can do, report supervisors out there and even teachers and everything, report every single time a white student says something racist. Prevent is going to be so congested, they're going to throw the whole legislation away.
By tomorrow, Theresa May's repealed it.
I think that's very unlikely.
Do it though, try it.
Yeah, report white student.
Any final thoughts?
If I can just respond, I think you're absolutely right that there has been insufficient questioning. Academics are a deeply acquiescent group. They haven't actually, despite the pickets that you see and so on, they've not come out in the numbers that you might expect they would come out in order to defend their own rights, never mind other people's rights. And I think this kind of thinking that if we talk about it and we're critical inside our heads, that will be enough, is a problem. I do think that with something like Prevent, and I raised it with the administration, and you know, unfortunately, I think the people who've challenged Prevent have been lone voices, where what you need is mass civil disobedience. You need the entirety of this university to stand up and say, sorry, we will not implement it because it is immoral to follow the rules when the rules are immoral. And I think this kind of a hand-wringing wet idea that you can sort of, be sort of critical about it inside your head, and that's enough, and that somehow acts as a papal indulgence, it's a get-out-of-jail-free card, is a problem. And what we need, and this is, I think, the fundamental, this is at the heart of decolonization, and it's a cross-racial imperative. You have to be critical and oppositional in meaningful ways. A decolonized university is an oppositional and critical space. And we have a very, very long way to go before we even begin to approximate that ideal.
And on that note, we should end. Thank you all very much for coming. And a massive thank you to all our panelists. Everyone here at the Union is extremely grateful for your attendance and your thoughts. If anyone has any further thoughts that they would like specifically the Union to consider, there is a feedback form on our website that you can use, or you can contact anyone whose email address is on there as well. Once again, thank you very much to all our panelists and to all of you.
We hope to see you at lots more Union Plus events. And there's a great time next time for events like these, so see you there.